I am Michela De Dominicis and I work at the National Oceanography Centre in Liverpool. And today I will talk about the effects of offshore wind farms and climate change in the North Sea. This work is part of the Pelagio project, which is funded by the EcoWind program. The question that we want to answer is how will a large-scale deployment of offshore wind turbines impact our seas? And the reason why we want to understand this is because the UK is committed to delivering up to 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And the physical, biogeochemical footprint of such large-scale expansion of offshore wind infrastructure into deeper waters and under the influence of climate change is unknown. The North Sea is a shelf sea, and shelf seas are usually seasonally stratified. This means that during winter, water is completely mixed, but during the summer, due to the effect of the atmospheric heating, they get seasonally stratified. In particular, deeper areas get seasonally stratified. This is because the water that is on top gets lighter, and so we have a two-layer system. Coastal waters are mixed all year round. So it's a balance in between the tidal mixing and the atmospheric heating that creates this seasonally stratified system. So we want to understand how offshore wind farms can potentially alter the natural equilibrium in between mixing and stratification. This was not a problem in the past because offshore wind farms were mainly installed in coastal mixed waters, but instead now offshore wind farms will be installed in deeper waters which are seasonally stratified. Altering the natural equilibrium between mixing and stratification can have effects on the distribution of nutrients, oxygen, phytoplankton, which is the basis of the food web for fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. So understanding how wind farms are altering potentially the mixing and stratification equilibrium is extremely important to understand how they can affect the ecosystem functioning. In Pelagio, we are using a combination of models and observations to understand how offshore wind farms can change the mixing and stratification equilibrium. We are using models at 3 different spatial scales, but in this presentation I will mainly show you some results from the shelf-wide model, which covers the entire Northwest European continental shelf. We have modified the ocean model to introduce two parameterization to include both mechanisms through which an offshore wind farm can change the mixing and stratification. One is a parameterization to take into account the modified wind field to reproduce the wind wake effect, and then a parameterization to reproduce the drag of the underwater structure and the associated mixing effects of the underwater structure. These parameterization are being calibrated and validated using data collected in 2023 and 2024 in the vicinity of the Sea Green wind farm, and this is very important to get some confidence in the model results that we are getting. The parameterizations are introduced into EFICOM and GOTEM, which are an ocean and turbulence model. And basically, using those two models, we can understand how the structure of temperature and salinity will change, how currents will change, and how turbulence will change. And this information can then be transferred to another model, which is called ERTSEM, which is a biogeochemical model that can tell us how those changes will then change the distribution of nutrients, oxygen, phytoplankton, so overall the changes in primary productivity of the system. This is then very relevant to understand how the rest of the ecosystem will be affected by those changes. Some preliminary results. This is how sea surface temperature, bottom temperature, and stratification change due to the presence of the sea green wind farm. The sea surface temperature is decreasing, the blue patch in the left bottom picture, while the bottom temperature is increasing, which is the middle bottom figure. And this overall means that the water on the top and bottom are getting similar in terms of temperature. And this means that the stratification is decreasing. We don't know if this is, which is the figure at the right. We don't know if this is good or bad. We are comparing, first of all, we are comparing these results with some data that we have collected in 2023 and 2024 using CDD, gliders, and moorings. And this is to get some confidence in the model results. And then we want to compare the changes that we are seeing with the natural variability, but also with the changes that we are seeing with climate change. For example, with climate change, stratification is increasing, so potentially offshore wind farms are counteracting the effect of climate change. This comparison with climate change and natural variability, and the comparison with natural variability, we can do it only because we have a very long multi-year model simulations. It's important to understand what are the acceptable threshold of change. And to conclude, offshore wind farms can perturbate the natural equilibrium between mixing and stratification with changes in nutrients, oxygen, and phytoplankton distribution. Those changes can have cascading effects on habitat, biodiversity, fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. We need to understand the acceptable threshold of change, comparing with natural variability and climate change. Observational data are usually limited in time and space and cannot be used to predict changes before offshore wind farms are installed operational. Changes at local and regional scales can be predicted using models and supported by observational campaigns. And site-specific and regional observation data taken in the vicinity of existing operational wind farms are needed to properly calibrate and validate models. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm a postdoc at the University of Aberdeen and part of the Pelagio project, and today I'm going to show you basic knowledge about the impact of offshore wind farms on hydrodynamic processes and primary production, and also a case study in the north. So we know that shallow seas are highly productive regions, and this satellite image of chlorophyll A from May 2024 shows that chlorophyll A can have quite a variable distribution, spatial distribution across the North Sea. And the different distribution, abundance, composition of phytoplankton depend a lot on the hydrodynamic processes. So the hydrodynamic processes define the amount of stratification and mixing in the water column, and the persistency of these conditions can be classified into regimes. So if we take, for example, the seasonally stratified waters, which is the green area, we typically have in the water column a density profile that shows a surface and a bottom mixed region, and then a picnocline where most of the phytoplankton is distributed and is concentrated. And depending on the characteristics of this water column, then we can have different species. So if we move, for example, to another hydrodynamic regime, we have most of the time, so we have more mixing over time. And because of this, we will have, for different reasons, like chlorophyll concentrated more at the surface or throughout the whole water column. And then we can have different species composition. So we can say that the system is quite complex. We can have different vertical distribution, which is also defining how much chlorophyll is available for all the trophic layer to be used and consumed. And then also different species or communities, some are better, some are worse. And this is also related to the physical characteristics of each region that also define how phytoplankton change over time. And this is why we want to investigate what is the impact of the wind farms on the phytoplankton. So as we know that wind farms are gonna affect hydrodynamic processes, we can talk about two main effects of the wind farms on the processes. One is called, or like it's represented as tidal wake, and it is the effect of any turbine foundation, which can be monopile, jacket, or floating, on the tidal current. So when we have a tidal current hitting the turbine foundation, we can see downstream the turbine an increase of mixing and turbulence. And this can reduce the stratification in the water column just after the wind turbine. Another effect is caused by the extraction of wind energy. So it is called wind wake, and downstream the wind turbine or the farm, we have a reduction of wind speed, and the reduction of wind speed causes an increase of stratification of the water column. So our case study focused in the northwest North Sea, and the other studies have been focusing in the southern or like central North Sea. These regions are shallower, and they are also characterized by different hydrodynamic regimes, and has been seen that the effect only of the wind wake, so the energy extraction, not the effect of the turbine foundation, in model scenario is showing an increase in primary production. And that happens because those shallow regions are quite mixed, and the increase of stratification due to the reduced wind speed at sea surface, so the mixing caused by the wind speed at sea surface, is enhancing the primary production. So we wanted to investigate what is happening in the deeper areas that are also characterized by mainly seasonally stratified waters. We used EFICOM, which is an oceanographic model, coupled to EarthSym, which is an ecosystem biogeochemical model, to investigate the effect only of the wind wake on the phytoplankton production. So we included a deficit, and so we included the reduction of the wind speed in the atmospheric forcing of our model. And these are some of the results showing changes in chlorophyll A in 3 different periods. So we have the pre-bloom on the left, the bloom period in the center, and then the post-bloom on the right. And these are almost monthly averages, and you can see that there are differences amongst periods, but there are also regions that remain quite the same. So we have an increase near the coastline, and then a decrease between the wind farms. If we take a transect crossing Inchcape, which is the middle wind farm, and we look at the variation in chlorophyll and potential energy anomaly, which is a proxy for stratification, we can see that along the transect, so there is a region where the wind farm is sitting, which is between the two dashed lines, and we have a region upwind, so no effects on not changes in the wind speed, which is near the coastline, and then downwind, where the wind speed was reduced due to the effect of the wind farms. And in that region, we saw an increase of stratification just after the wind farm, and that caused a decrease in chlorophyll A abundance. And that could be caused by the isolation of the nutrients in the already stratified waters. So I have briefly showed you the results of our preliminary study, and this is going to be expanded within Pelagio by including the effect of the wind turbines foundation, and also investigating further the impact on phytoplankton species composition and how much these effects are actually significant for higher trophic layer. So please feel free to contact any of us, at least from the modeling aspect within Pelagio, and thank you very much for listening.
Hello, my name is Niels Christiansen, and I will talk about the far-field impacts that offshore wind farms can have on ocean physics and the marine ecosystem. So by introducing offshore wind energy infrastructure into the marine ecosystem, the turbines basically create an immediate impact on the environment due to their presence. And thereby there are different stressors arising from these artificial structures. So for example, we observe biological effects like artificial reefs, as these structures basically could create new habitats for marine species, or there are chemical effects from the pollution of contaminants which can influence the environment. And furthermore, there are physical effects from harvesting the wind energy and from the structures in the water column, which both can influence the ocean dynamics. And in this talk, I will focus specifically on the physical effects, as these are the ones where we observe the far-field impacts on the ocean. So when we talk about physical effects, there are basically two major effects that influence ocean dynamics. On the one hand, we have wind wakes, which emerge due to the extraction of wind energy and imply lower wind speeds and higher turbulence in the atmosphere. And these effects can cause attenuated wind speeds near the sea surface and influence the air-sea exchange and the transfer of momentum into the ocean. And on the other hand, we have tidal wakes, which emerge behind the cylindrical piles of the turbines that are associated with high levels of turbulent kinetic energy and can intensify water column mixing inside the offshore wind farm areas. So as both of these effects disturb the current velocity in the water, questions arise whether offshore wind energy production has an impact on ocean dynamics both locally and regionally, and secondly, whether these changes in physics can actually translate to marine ecosystems, and in particular biogeochemistry and lower trophic levels. So over the last decade, there have been several observations and measurements of the wake effects and their extent, and I'm showing you here just two examples of satellite images of the wind and the tidal wakes. So in the top panel, you see the large-scale wind speed reductions in darker colors that propagate behind the wind farms in the German Bight. So depending on the atmospheric conditions, wind wakes can extend up to 100 kilometers and thereby affect large areas around the wind farm sites. In the bottom panel, we see the sediment plumes at the wind farm near the British coast that are caused by the turbulence of the tidal wakes behind the wind turbines. And you can see here clearly that these tidal wakes emerge on much smaller local scales than the wind wakes and can reach distances of a few kilometers behind the turbines. So to study these effects, we can implement the wind speed reduction and also the subsurface drag into our ocean models. And I'm showing you here two examples of two of our studies where we simulated the wind wakes and the tidal wakes, here shown in the upper and the lower panel. So we use different parameterizations to emulate the wake effects and analyze the long-term impacts on hydrodynamics. And as an example, I'm showing here 5-year average changes in surface velocity due to the combined impact of wind and tidal wakes in the German Bight. And you can clearly see that the current velocity decreases at the wind farm sites, but also in downstream direction along the northward residual current that we have in the German Bight. So obviously the wake effects not only influence the ocean currents locally, where they originate, but also up to tens to hundreds of kilometers in the far field of the wind farm sites. So therefore, they lead to large-scale regional changes in ocean physics, which basically manifests on the long term in the system. So with the changes in current velocity and turbulence, the wake effects influence the mixing of the water column. For wind wakes, for example, the reduction of the shear-induced turbulence leads to a reduction of the mixing around the offshore wind farm sites. And as a consequence, surface layer mixing decreases, and we observe here large-scale surface heating on the simulated 5-year average. And you can see that these effects not only occur locally, but extend also far beyond the wind farm boundaries. Tidal wakes, on the other hand, cause opposing effects with regard to mixing. So the strong turbulent kinetic energy that is created at the wind turbines intensify the water column mixing and thus bring up colder and denser bottom water, which is leading to destratification inside the wind farm areas. So overall, in comparison, we see that the impact of wind wakes influences much larger areas, while the impact of tidal wakes remains rather local with stronger amplitudes. So we are currently investigating how these two effects interact and hopefully can report on this soon then. When we look into the future of offshore wind energy production, we see that the plans for the North Sea basically involve an intensive development across the Shelf Sea from Belgium to Denmark up to the Scottish waters. And this development, of course, then raises the question about implications for the future marine ecosystem in the North Sea. So a couple of years ago, we had a study on the impact of wind wakes arising from a hypothetical future scenario in the southern North Sea. And you can see here in the center the impact of a 120 gigawatt production on the wind speed at hub height, and then on the right, the related consequences for ocean currents. So in contrast to the slide before, the results I showed you before, you see that for this future scenario, the impact on current velocity becomes much larger in magnitude, which also can be seen in changes for ocean mixing and density stratification. And in fact, in this study, we coupled the ocean model to an ecosystem model, an MPZD ecosystem model, to see the changes in biogeochemistry and lower trophic levels. And you can see here the changes in bottom shear stress on the bottom left, which reflect the changes in the current speed from the slide before. So we see that as a result of the decreasing velocity, bottom shear stress becomes attenuated and reduces by about 10%. So this has, of course, then implications for other processes like seabed mobility. So for instance, we observe increasing seabed sediment biomass at the bottom, since less shear stress results in less resuspension of sediment and therefore in more deposition in the affected areas. Furthermore, we found that the changes in the water column mixing and stratification influence the annual net primary production both in a positive and a negative way. And in fact, we detected large-scale spatial redistribution across the North Sea, which are in some ways related to the changes in stratification strength that we observed. And thereby the magnitudes of these changes were around plus minus 10% as well. So to conclude, I would like to summarize here the impact of the wind wakes and tidal wakes on the ocean and provide some of our studies in case you would like to read more about it. So in a nutshell, wind wakes reduce surface currents and turbulence and thereby can cause large-scale impacts on regional hydrodynamics, while the tidal wakes cause local hotspots of turbulent mixing that can influence stratification beyond the wind farm boundaries even. So these far-field impacts have consequences for the marine ecosystem in the end, where we found regional impacts on, for example, the spatial distribution of primary production or on seabed mobility and bottom water oxygen. Thank you very much.